And our third speaker this morning is Dr. Farmelo, well-known author, most recently of Churchill's Bomb, A Hidden History of Science, War and Politics. He's going to talk about Lindemann.
Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you to Joe for inviting me and for setting up this this day and its theme, which I hope is less topical than it might appear. I have to say this is a big topic. We've seen that in Frank's great opening talk. I'm going to stick to the brief that Joe gave me. I will concentrate on Lindemann, talk a little about the émigrés that he brought to this great university. There's far more knowledge about those people in the audience than I have, and so there'll be a lot of comment and anecdote and discussion afterwards, I'm sure. And I'm going to try to give a picture of how Lindemann affected this renaissance about which you've already heard. I'd just like to start by saying that of all the physicists in Oxford, I don't think anyone comes close to Lindemann for the sheer amount of discussion of his contribution, both written. I think there are at least 5 biographies of him, and also the amount of public comment about this figure, in particular after C.P. Snow's famous entertaining but thoroughly misleading book about his relationship with Henry Tizard. Not all the comment about Lindemann was entirely favourable. Shortly after he died, there was a prominent newspaper feature where Admiral Chief Marshal Philippe de la Ferte said that it was always helpful to know where Lindemann stood on any matter, because he was always absolutely wrong. Now, as I'm going to try to persuade you, I don't think that's entirely accurate, but it was the view of many people in the military, and this singular figure who took up the Dr. Lee professorship in 1919 when he was aged only 33. It's a good appointment. The people who appointed him wanted him to put physics on the map, as we would now say, in Oxford. Now, a word about context. This is, I think, quite important. The first thing to say is that the modern discipline of physics is essentially a French invention. It was invented in the Napoleonic era, beginning of the 19th century, by Laplace and his associates. Physics becoming a subject that was part of what used to be called natural philosophy, a term that endured long afterwards. You try telling Maxwell and Faraday they were physicists. They wanted nothing to do with it. They were natural philosophers. Faraday, an experimental philosopher. Maxwell always called himself a mathematical philosopher. Now, physics, the reason why physics has the status that it has today became particularly clear in that 19th century, when it was abundantly clear. Forget people like us. I imagine most of us are physicists in some sense, even if we're simply associates of the subject. It's an extremely useful subject, right, for governments who are looking for imperial reach, and for industry who simply want reliable laws on which to build profitable ventures. Of course, we physicists, the way we're trained, we talk about looking for fundamental laws and what have you. Well, that's important, but that's not what particularly drove the great success in the mid-19th century. And you look at that success with its use in development of heat engines, for example, with the great burgeoning of the communications industry. Remember, that was what really got Maxwell's equations on the map. I find it quite funny that physicists still seem to think that Maxwell was looking for the fundamental laws of nature, right? Yes, he probably was thinking about that, but you look at his correspondence, and much of it was about the telecommunications industry that he was helping with his equations, which hardly anyone in that industry understood. And of course, the common or garden applications of civil engineering. Now, by the mid-19th century, there's no question that the preeminent part of Europe in terms of practicing physics was Germany. It was extremely strong by virtue of support from government and industry and from its adapting educational institutions. Theoretical physics was born there. It first became a profession in the early 1860s with Max Planck, the first full-time theoretical physicist. And it really is no coincidence that the two great theories of 20th century physics that all of us know about, quantum theory and relativity, that the lion's share of individual contributions came from either Germans or German speakers, people trained in Germany. The problem is that here in this fair city of Oxford, quantum theory and relativity were not, was everyone was discussing over lunch every day. They had been somewhat left behind, and that's the thing that Lindemann was brought in to address. Now, in terms of, if you now look back with the wisdom of hindsight, from the self-interested physicist point of view, it was very smart of Lindemann to have been born with the parents he had, because his father, as Frank said, was a German citizen who emigrated to the United Kingdom. He was born with very much a silver spoon, shining silver spoon in his mouth, and he was educated, no doubt thanks to his father's guidance, in Germany, where he was inculcated in this thriving culture of science, but in particular physics. Tremendous burgeoning of theoretical physics and experimental physics working arm in arm. He got his PhD there in 1911, and afterwards he tried to sign up immediately. He always regarded himself as British. He often said that I only ever had one passport. Right? That was a British passport. He was an intensely British person, despite that complicated lineage. But he went to work in the aviation development laboratory in Farmelo, which is where he did a lot of excellent work. And it was from there where he had the luxury, because he had so much money, he could take his time, of taking up the position in Oxford. Now, the old Clarendon, as we mentioned, Lindemann's predecessor, his name was Robert Bellamy Clifton, appointed in 1865, when physics was really taking off in Germany. Now, it's probably a cheap shot, but I can't resist a comment I read that he was there until 1915, and it was alleged that he wrote one good paper in 50 years. Not a great record. It may be unfair. I'm not in a position to comment. But I think it is fair to say that he did not leave a thriving department, although interestingly, I've read that in 1872, the first purpose-built physics laboratory was set up here in Oxford. Historians are always good at setting up exceptions. So if I were writing that, I would say one of the first purpose-built, and then that gets you out of trouble. So they were looking, after 1915, during the First World War, they were looking, the Oxford authorities, to put physics back on the map. Good time to do it. Quantum theory was really taking off, and of course this was a time when the advanced quantum mechanics and of course relativity were going to come to a fruition. Lindemann got terrific references. You can actually read some of them. They came from, and he picked them very well. Millikan, great choice. Michelson, Lord Raleigh, and the great Rutherford. Rutherford, who took over at the Cavendish at almost exactly the same time, right? Lindemann was in close touch with him. Rutherford gave him I haven't actually read that reference, but I gather it was a very good one, and that was very important in getting Lindemann that post. And afterwards, Lindemann wrote to Rutherford in a letter often quoted in the Cavendish later, saying how he looked forward to close and fruitful collaboration between the Clarendon and the Cavendish. So in 1919, the Prof, as he later became known, moved to Oxford to take up his position, and he was billeted initially in the Randolph Hotel. And I'd like just to have a think about what he must have been thinking at that time. Ambitious young physicist, pretty much at the top of his game. The university funds were in dire straits. 2 years later, he had to contribute his own money to the department to help keep it afloat. Terrible labs. I've even been told there was no electricity being installed in those labs. There were 5 physicists doing finals, 2 research students. Physics had a terribly low status, something, as we've heard earlier, was deeply resented by Lindemann. And there was another professor of physics, John Townsend, and that gave ample opportunity for turf wars that believe me, became an epic turf war that I'm not going to concentrate on because I could spend all day on it. The way to understand what Lindemann did in Oxford is to look broadly, yes, but there's one particular figure that is extremely important, and that's this gentleman here, Walter Nernst. Now, he would have called himself, or in fact, he did call himself a chemist, but in the way that physicists always appropriate the best science to their own subject, we would call him an honorary physicist. He, very well known in Berlin, attended, yes, chemistry seminars and physics seminars, seen as royalty. He must qualify as a physicist because he actually came up with a fundamental law of nature, the third law of thermodynamics, which might be stated very concisely, perhaps slightly inaccurately, is that the entropy of a perfect crystal at absolute zero is zero. He did an enormous amount of work in, this is important, not just very fine experimentation, working closely with theoreticians, working unsnobbishly with industry and within academia. He saw it as a big enterprise, so to speak. There was none of this sort of snobbish and narrow-minded, I'm a theoretician, I never go near that, or I never want to go be near those equations kind of thing. He was in it heart and soul. Always I read just a couple of days ago, in the front row of the seminars with Einstein later on. Very, very well respected. Another thing, very important, when it became clear that one of the primary testing grounds of the new quantum theory, which virtually nobody understood, let's be clear, nobody understood when it came out, least of all Planck, who was the genius who came up with the initial idea of the quantization of energy, it was extremely unclear what this subject meant. But when it became clear that one of the testing grounds of this assembly of ideas was in low temperature physics, when all the thermal vibrations were, if you like, shrunk down, and you were left with a residual motion that you could study and the amazing properties of matter that came out of it, later superfluidity, superconductivity, and changes of phases of matter under pressure and what have you. This chap did something very bold and very brave, that if you've ever run any institution, certainly a physics lab, you'll know how brave it was. He turned the lab round to focus on that subject. Of course, history remembers you well if it's successful. If you're not, you're dismissed as a loser. This gentleman was triumphant in that and turned Berlin into a great centre for low temperature physics research, and this was Lindemann's supervisor. And Lindemann always looked up to him when he came to Oxford in the 1930s. Way later, it was like the world's most senior royalty visiting this city. As Andrew said in his lucid talk, Nernst was a prime mover in setting up the first Solvay meeting, invitation only. He got Lindemann there as his secretary. Lindemann would have loved that, hobnobbing with the great physicist. Einstein was in about his second year as a superstar physicist, having come, still one of the most remarkable stories in physics, it has to be said, from a complete outsider working in a patent office to somebody who was giving physics lessons to almost everyone. There he is with his Einstein's hero and someone Lindemann valued very much, Lorentz, as Einstein, who was busy being quite sniffy about Poincaré there, we later read. But this was absolutely formative for Lindemann, who became a close friend, no, I'll take that back, a friend of Einstein, and that's in Einstein's words, incidentally. I mean, you actually read that in Einstein, he clearly regarded him as a friend, and we see in the consequences of that already. So, Lindemann was inspired by Nernst. He was sitting at the top table of physics. He had great connections. I should have said Lindemann was quite clearly a first-rate physicist. I mean, later on people can sneer. People always do that and condescend to achievements of youth. But he was smart. He was quick with insights. He was good with his hands. He had a complete gift for taking a complex topic and simplifying it and seeing its essential features, something that was said by one of his many frenemies, G.P. Thompson. So he was, without question, a talented person, and there was no surprise when he was elected here as the Dr. Lee Professor. But look at the situation he faced. He was given this great challenge, but the university was in dire straits. It only survived in 1922 because of a £30,000 grant. That's an enormous amount of money, right? £30,000 grant came from the government. Soon afterwards, that became the grant came from the University Grants Committee. And then it happened again the year after, and then it realised that the government had to keep putting money in to keep this and other universities afloat. His first attempt to generate a Nernst-type centre of physics did not end well. He acquired a hydrogen liquefier from Nernst, but he simply, I know it sounds comic now, but it was a very unreliable piece of apparatus, and he just couldn't get it to work. And although I haven't seen any written evidence of this, this appears to have disheartened Lindemann, and from 1924 he didn't publish any more original research. He was concentrating entirely on administering the department and trying to set it up. Now, time forbids me to give a detailed account of those first nearly 10 years, or just over 10 years actually, but I think it's fair to say that it wasn't a great success initially. There was one success, and that was Egerton, the thermodynamicist, who was doing research into knocking in internal combustion engines. But most of the appointments that Lindemann made were individuals. Some of them would just work at home. They didn't feel there was any need to come into to the university. And there was absolutely no sense of a pullulating physics department that he would have seen in Berlin. But he was looking unsnobbishly for collaborations with local firms and industry. So it was a difficult. His heart was in the right place, but in those times, rich people, independent people doing science, a hangover from the 19th century and earlier, that was the order of the day then, and it certainly wasn't a great success. If you compare that with, for example, the Cavendish, where you have the great Rutherford in like a blazing chariot, it would not have felt good, of course. But of course, there's far more to Lindemann than his physics. While he was, I'm sure, working sedulously here in Oxford, but without great success, he was being very successful in other fields in ways that later would prove to be very important, not just for him, but for many other people too. Why is Lindemann like a Channel steamer, the joke went? The answer is he runs from pier to pier. Yeah, I have to say that joke has got to be true, because that's what he loved the aristocracy, yearned to be a member of that said group. He, at a garden party given by, I think, the richest private individual in Britain, the Duke of Westminster, in August 1922, he met this gentleman here, Winston Churchill, somebody whom Lindemann admired greatly. He's about to be, shortly afterwards, would become Chancellor of the Exchequer. Now, fair to say that Lindemann definitely wanted to meet Churchill. and become his friend. We know that from a letter he wrote Lindemann wrote to his father. Initially, the relationship did not take off that well, and I think the reason for that is that the two men were so completely different. We all know about Churchill, don't we? It's part of our birthright. Love food and wine, gregarious, could be, and often was, very generous-spirited, loved the limelight, loved the arts, a person of letters, painting, all the rest of it. Lindemann, an almost complete little, a strict vegetarian, almost completely teetotal, very selective of his friends, an Olympian grudge bearer, slight at time t equals 0, t equals 35 years later, still remembered very vividly. He didn't like the limelight at all. And that's interesting because he wanted to be respected, but he did want, and this is why we've seen so few pictures of him today, and will see so few. A BBC researcher told me a couple of years ago she could find no recordings of Lindemann's voice. That's extraordinary when you think of such a prominent public figure. And of course, he had absolutely no taste for the arts. Churchill's friend, and I believe an early girlfriend, Violet Bonham Carter, said that Lindemann was stone blind in areas outside physics. He would stand in front of a Rembrandt and say, I don't know what all the fuss is about, you could get a much better likeness from a photograph. But anyway, in his own area, and that sort of attitude did not endear him to our arts friend, of course. That did not endear him to others, but Churchill was quite happy to become his friend because Lindemann was very useful to him and extremely loyal. That's a very important thing, part of being in the Churchill circle. Now, there was another class of person that Lindemann wanted to know. Aristocrats were helpful, politicians were helpful, but people who were extremely wealthy were also part of his hit list. And one of his best, we would now say mates, although that word would never pass his lips, is this gentleman here, Alfred Maund, Lord Melchett, a veteran of World War I, a would-be poet and writer, and director and part owner of ICI. Now, when I saw how much he was paying Lindemann for his consultancies, I did a calculation with my calculator using the what do they call it, inflation adjuster. I did not believe that it was possible to earn that much money from consultancy. It was as if he was a hedge fund manager. It was quite extraordinary. Anyway, he was employing Lindemann, and Lindemann was going to his soirees, including one that you may have read about in Churchill's Bond, where Churchill chairs a meeting with Lindemann in his new apartment, richly featured in House and Garden, presenting the discoveries of the Cambridge. Quite remarkable event held in that home. But that association with Britain's, I think its wealthiest company, as we've heard of here again, turned out to be very important. Now, Lindemann had been in Oxford about 10 years, and as he really must have known, especially with flourishing of physics elsewhere and on the continent, with the burgeoning of quantum mechanics, for example, if he were to realise that ambition of setting up a physics bomb, he had to get his finger out. And he decided to return to this vision he had when he first arrived of setting up a really good cryogenics, low temperature physics unit. And he then went back and started to consult with his hero Nernst and Nernst's students. In particular, Francis Simon, a fellow student of Nernst and a good friend of Lindemann's from way back. In 1930, Lindemann went over to Berlin, but Simon wasn't there. He was off taking up another position by then. He was an international star in the field of cryogenics. He just spent 10 years building up the department. I can imagine Lindemann would be less than human if he didn't feel like he must have felt a degree of envy, at least a scientific envy, because he had been struggling to set up this department. Simon was, as I said, an international star in his field. with a whole slew of achievements under his belt. The solidification of helium, measurement of low temperature specific heats and what have you. Very well regarded colleague too. But he wasn't there. Someone who was though, and we're going to hear more about this from somebody in the audience I suspect later on, was Kurt Mendelssohn. Very, very bright young chap. Only, I believe, 23 years old when they met up, so he was really, really quite a young chap. Superb communicator, just the kind of person you want to transfer skills from one lab to another. And Lindemann invited Mendelssohn to Oxford in 1930. He wanted to get helium liquefied here in this city. He got him over eventually. It wasn't easy. And Mendelssohn worked night and day for 2 weeks. This was Christmas 1932. He came over from Berlin. He went to the Clarendon, got his piece of apparatus, night and day, terrible cold, one we hear, and he became the first person to liquefy helium in the United Kingdom. Now, that was a considerable achievement. One could give a whole talk about that. Lindemann was absolutely cock-a-hoop. There's a good reason for that, because Cambridge were currently building a lab for Rutherford's favourite research son, Peter Kapitsa, and they hadn't opened yet. And what Kapitsa was desperately hoping to do was liquefy helium. So when this discovery in Oxford was published in Nature, Lindemann did what only he could do. He stressed the low cost of the research at Oxford and how they had been first to the topic. And he arranged that there was a picture of the empty new Mond laboratory right opposite the article that publicised his article. I might say, this is gossip, but it's irresistible gossip. Until that point, relationships had been very good with Rutherford, right? That and one other thing I'm going to mention soured them to an extent that it became a virulent hatred, which is never a good thing, but it's fascinating if you're interested in the dynamics of physics. And boy, did he draw blood. In Moscow, I found several letters where it obviously deeply pained Kapitsa. Frankly, I have to say, this is. I mean, Kapitsa was great, absolutely great experimentalist. There's no question about that. But you could see him desperately working out how on earth he managed to do this. And there's several letters where Lindemann is basically flicking his imaginary cigar ash, if he smoked, on Kapitsa. Kapitsa couldn't work out how on earth they'd managed to do this so quickly and so cheaply. And next year, the lab was open with Stanley Baldwin, royalty, what have you, but Oxford had beaten them to it, and Lindemann had put Oxford on the map. That is absolutely critical. That was the time when people all over Europe were looking at saying, all right, they hadn't done it first, but Britain is now catching up with this low temperature physics. Meanwhile, still, it's always important to remember that Lindemann is not just working hard here. He's up in London. He's at the great houses of royalty and aristocracy, and he's deepening his relationship with Churchill by the month. He's the most regular or the most frequent visitor to Chartwell, and was until the end of his life, sorting out Churchill's tax forms, advising him on everything under the sun, including drafting the articles that made, as I say, and I think it pretty well disclosed in Churchill's bomb, Churchill became, of all the star writers, the one that was writing most frequently on science. Although Churchill undoubtedly made contributions of those articles, it's not completely wrong to say that most of those articles were in large part due to Lindemann, who was absolutely gifted, it has to be said. One of his greatest gifts was this of clear exposition, if he understood the topic, accurate précis, and an ability to sift out what is interesting to people who are not physicists. The article in the fake, I should say fake, it wasn't really fake news, it was unintentional fake news last week about alien life that Churchill wrote, that was almost certainly written by Lindemann. In fact, it was actually published in 1942, which meant the story was slightly out of date. But he wrote about 30 articles for Churchill, which were widely read, particularly the ones of the News of the World, which were read by 4 million people every weekend for a time. I mean, that's absolutely amazing. Extremely well informed, very entertaining, and I would say really quite accurate in standards of popular writing. They were very good examples of that. Just a quick interregnum. It's very important here that we don't write out the contribution of women in our story. This wasn't on Joe's list, but I wanted to say that, and we'll see this again later on, there were important women physicists in the new Clarendon, and one of perhaps the most accomplished was Helen Megor here, an Irish crystallographer who later achieved the distinction of becoming the first female to achieve what we would now call tenure at the Cavendish. And she did, at the recommendation of Bernal, she spent a year working with Simon here. Right, now the climax of the Lindemann story as it applies to the theme of our gathering today. In Easter 1933, just after the triumph of Mendelssohn and the other colleagues at the Clarendon, just after Lindemann's talking about the triumphs of the Cambridge University and what have you earlier on in the previous year, Lindemann saw accurately that Germany was about to, if you'll allow me, collapse. It was 1933. Hitler had just been elected, in inverted commas, and the whole system was looking precarious, to put it mildly. Mendelssohn later wrote that Lindemann saw the possibility of creating in Oxford a worthwhile continuation of the Nernst school. I think very accurate words. So around Easter, Lindemann, his valet, Harvey, a former boxer, like Lindemann himself, went off in his Rolls Royce on the continent and drove into the heart of Germany, going around looking for people who might want to come and work in the UK, in particular in Oxford, and people with whom those colleagues might want to associate. This, ladies and gentlemen, was absolutely critical. He saw, I would say, the chance to do good and the chance to do well. I would say that sums it up. There were people there who were desperate. Right? Lindemann saw that there could be mutual advantage in bringing them to Oxford in particular and setting up a Nernst-like school. Very important for the dynamics in the physics community is that his trip happened at almost the exact same time, within, I think it's a week, it might be 2 weeks, of the famous Academic Assistance Council, which became a very important organisation in bringing refugees from all the strife in Europe. That was led by LSE Director Beveridge, with Rutherford at his side, right? And Lindemann did not sign that first declaration. That was something that was very wounding, I know. I've really looked into this, and it's astonishing how discreet those people were. What Lindemann was doing was actually negotiating separate contracts, taking advantage of what I said earlier, the great munificence of the imperial chemical industries. He did a brilliant, absolutely brilliant job of securing grants from ICI. I haven't got time to detail it because there are so many of them, and it was quite remarkable how he milked that particular funding agency and enabled so many of those physicists, several of whom I'm going to mention in a minute, to work in Oxford. The problem was, of course, that those physicists were doing quite a lot better than ones under the Academic Assistance Council. That, ladies and gentlemen, is, I can't prove it, but I'm very confident is the reason how Rutherford and Lindemann fell out. One was Rutherford frankly being miffed That's small-minded, but it's the way people are. Myth about being scooped, but then the Academic Assistance Council basically having a private arm administered through Lindemann. I think that did it. And afterwards, it was a kind of one of these ridiculous turf wars that you get in physics and any other subjects that centred not particularly on Rutherford, who was to die in 1937, but he is perhaps most brilliant experimental student, Patrick Blackett, who became Lindemann's bête noire. The biggest catch was Francis Simon. He anglicised his first name. As I've already said, superb physicist, no question about that. An intellectual magnet, one of these academics, you put him or her into a department and they attract people from all over. His house, quite near the Clarendon, became a kind of pied-à-terre of warmth and generosity. It was always a place that always makes you tear up when you think about it. These people coming with absolutely nothing. There would be a place at the Simon table. Lindemann, to his great credit, got Simon tenure in Oxford. Simon, one of the few people who was given tenure by British universities. A remark that I treasure, Vicky Weisskopf, we mentioned earlier on, that in not taking more of those refugees, Britain really did miss a trick. We could have done so much more with those people. As it was, and this is not a particularly nice part of history, but worthy of a gathering of Joe's of its own, but we were effectively waving them through to the United States. And I think that was a terrible loss. But Lindemann, without doubt, has a badge of honour here for what he did. Simon, as I said, was his star recruit. Someone almost equal star power was Nicholas Curti. We've spoken about him. Very high priority was to get this gentleman here, one of these people with an embarrassment of talent. He wasn't just good at physics and mathematics, he was good at just about everything. He was even good at music, and he even auditioned in front of Bela Bartok. How about that? The guy was absolutely amazing. He had a very peculiar take on life, though, because physics was his priority. In his time in Berlin, where he started to shine, as so many physicists did in that era, he was particularly expert on the entropy of salts. And this led to him to have a comment that only a physicist would make, I think. Gadolinium sulfate, for me, it was love at first sight. He was a first-rate practical experimentalist. When he moved the chemistry into the kitchen, he was even more distinguished. That's how I became familiar with him on TV, as many people in my industry would have remembered. It needs to be said, lots of tensions here, where people were not preserving their ranks here. And Lindemann had a difficult job here because he had these people here. They were not being paid hugely well compared with people who were doing nothing like as good, who had permanent jobs in Oxford. But somehow Lindemann managed to actually square the circle by ensuring that Simon and Curti were principally on thermodynamic aspects of low temperature physics, paramagnetic cooling and what have you, and that Mendelssohn was working mainly on superconductivity and liquid helium. So they were tense times, but he had brought that group, that constellation of stars together. Also brought somebody, another testing ground for quantum theory, spectroscopy, light emitted and absorbed by atoms. And one of the star spectroscopists at the time, trained by the great James Frank in Göttingen, just taken from one of the greatest centres of scientific and mathematical research in history to a shell within months by Hitler. So he was brought here and given plenty of investment by Lindemann and his colleagues. Wasn't asked to speak about London, very important person as well, a superb theorist. Another one not asked to mention, but I want to just give him an honourable mention because it speaks very well of Lindemann here, is that he got Leo Szilard here. Now, Szilard was an extremely difficult character. right? Visionary, brilliant, no question about that, but wanted to live life on his terms. And I've looked at that correspondence in great detail, and I have to say Lindemann was extremely generous in allowing Szilard to flit across the Atlantic pretty much as he felt like. So it's not fair to say, as J.J. Thompson did, that he ran the Clarendon like a Prussian dictator. I mean, Prussian dictators don't do things like that. At this time, the 1930s, in addition to this great renaissance that Lindemann was responsible for, very important to remember that was virtually unknown in the public sphere. What people knew about in high places was that Lindemann was part of a Tweedledee and Tweedledum double act in Westminster. And this was with Winston Churchill on a matter of air defence. They were harassing the government to improve their air defences because of the monumental build-up of armaments in Churchill's Germany. This is a very complicated topic. Churchill and Lindemann behaved appallingly some of the time. They also showed much wisdom. Lindemann became sworn enemies with many absolutely first-rate physicists like Blackett. It's one of these things that becomes a horrible mess when you just wish people could just get past personality and actually concentrate on physics. But if you look at the positive side of it, Lindemann, yes, he had many harebrained ideas about defence. Blackett said every single one of them was wrong. I can't say whether that's accurate or not, but it's certainly true to say that Lindemann was not gifted in the art of judging the effectiveness of weapons. But he did assist Churchill, and of course that would come to a fruition later on. By the late 30s, Oxford was becoming one of the British powerhouses, and Lindemann had even got the funds to build. Rutherford had died after a botched operation, and it was looking clear now for Lindemann to start to get a real ascendancy and perhaps preeminence of this department. And he was getting the money to build a new Clarendon laboratory. It's a very telling quote from the proceedings of the advisory committee on that Clarendon laboratory. He was planning, and I think with some shrewdness here, to set up, if you like, an alternative centre of excellence to the Cavendish. He argued to that committee in ways that were less confrontational than was typical of him, that Oxford graduates were, I quote, of more use to industry than Cambridge graduates, because more attention was paid here in Oxford to old-fashioned physics, and that the practical problems of industry needed more knowledge of that than of modern nuclear physics. Now, there's an element of truth in that. I think it's a more practically minded, less kind of Diracian, Eddingtonian flavour to the physics. Of course, sensible people like us know there's a place for all these things. But he was, I think, making a valid point that this fixation with endlessly going into lower regions within the atom and in gravity, there is more to physics than that, and there are other ways in which you could do great research. Now, by at the end, 1939, the new building was all but ready, and the architecture may be called the Lindemann aesthetic. I remember when I first saw it, it looked like a kind of modified shoebox to me. This was absolutely not a Brunelleschi, you can tell that. But this was these were the new facilities that Lindemann had sought, and I tried so hard to pin it down accurately, but I think it's accurate to say that he had barely settled in his office, right? The paint was barely dry when he was basically off into Whitehall at the beginning of the Second World War. Thank you. Very quickly. We started off with Chamberlain. By May 1940, as Frank said, the great Rudy Piles and Otto Fritsch had hit on the brilliant idea terrible idea in some ways, but brilliant notion that it was possible, contrary to what Rutherford and many others had been lecturing the public for years, that a nuclear weapon was out of the question, that if you could purify uranium-235, a particular isotope of uranium, and pull them together smash them together, form a critical mass, you could, in principle, set up a nuclear weapon. The challenge was, of course, that uranium-235 is extremely rare, and physicists better probably than almost any people in this audience said it was never going to be possible. One of them was Niels Bohr. Gave a lecture that Christmas and forget it, it's never going to happen. Right? The challenge was actually to form to isolate 235, and the favoured method here in Oxford was of gaseous diffusion, forcing uranium hexafluoride through fine membranes, separating the two isotopes. And of course, the mastermind of that was, of course, Francis Simon. Here's his group. Notice how many women there are in that group. There's a book to be written there, Forgotten Women of the British Bomb Project, to complement the Atomic City one, written in the United States about the Manhattan Project. Simon was a tremendous asset to this project. Lindemann, as often happened, was unsure. He had not got the greatest feel for the physics here. Simon had. And you could see on Saturday mornings, Lindemann would come up from his hotel in London, and they would be talking in the car park about progress that Simon and his colleagues were making. Simon was, in the Nanstian way, talking with Metro Vickers, talking with other great industrial organisations about the viability of building a plant that could make that weapon in the UK. He was also, incidentally, because of his open-heartedness, drafting in some unusual help in the form of the engineering skills of Paul Dirac. Yes, Dirac, recruited by Pars brilliantly on his own terms. Dirac was working as an applied mathematician at his home, but he was also working here in the Clarendon, getting his coupons and coming over here and working, advising them in his capacity as an engineer. So he was assisting all those people you said there, including Fuchs. So, let me move on quickly because I haven't got much time here. During the war, of course, Lindemann was almost entirely, his head was completely down with Churchill. I would love a proper analysis of Lindemann's strategic choices. There's absolutely no question that he was the most influential person in science and technology. Whether it's right to say that his judgment was often wrong, I don't know. I'd like to see that properly evaluated. It's not the most pressing topic in the history of science and technology, but it's an interesting one that somebody's got to probe. After the war, Lindemann returned, like everybody else, totally exhausted. But he had, by then, it was quite clear to everyone in senior ranks of physics that Oxford was on the map, had, courtesy of the Émigrés and others, a first-rate physics department that had more than pulled its weight in the war. Lindemann, you may hate him, but he had more than contributed to the war effort. Very hurriedly, I would just say, because it is important to get, because Lindemann gets so much flack, it is important to say that after that he did things that, in my opinion, are way underrated. He did not want to go back with Churchill in 1951 when Churchill was ridiculously, no, I shouldn't say that, where he was elected gloriously unfit for office, to use Roy Jenkins' term. But he did go back, was very tired, very unwell, ailing, and he did a lot of very good work. He persuaded Churchill, and it really was important, it was not just triggered, that Churchill would have dropped the British nuclear stuff completely and made us a satellite state of America. Lindemann was not having that, and he almost solely persuaded Churchill to develop the British nuclear power industry and the independent nuclear deterrent. And after the terrible relations he had with many of the leading Cavendish scientists and others, during the war, he had excellent relations with the three knights who made it possible, Cockcroft, and the great engineer Christopher Hinton. Finally, because I see people who have former Director General here, it was on Churchill's watch, with Lindemann at his side, that Britain signed up to CERN. Yes, it's true, Lindemann was not the most enthusiastic person. If he could have stopped it, if he wanted to stop it, he could have done. So that actually happened on Churchill's watch. The really sad thing was that he's desperate to get out, as they say at that time of life, by 1956, and his successor was just the person he wanted. It was Franz Simon, who took up the post on the 1st of October 1956, and he was dead within a month of taking up that post. Very sad. James Chadwick, one of Rutherford's admirers, wrote and said what a terrible shock it was, and it was indeed a terrible loss both to Lindemann and perhaps more important to Oxford. So let me just summarise this. I think is what may fairly be called a renaissance. Lindemann began with a physics department that I think may fairly be described as moribund. He did have a slow first decade. He was opportunistic in the 30s. What's wrong with opportunism? If you're building up a department, he saw a chance to do good and to do well. The high watermark was the recruiting of Simon, Curti and others to set up a world-class low-temperature physics group, and those same people made vital contributions to the British bomb project, eventually subsumed into the Manhattan Project. Lindemann's other achievements in the public sphere as a writer, as an eminence grise to Churchill, should not, I would submit, be underestimated. And he gave Oxford a strong basis for growth, and we now see the results. So, Admiral de la Ferté, was he wrong about everything? Well, he was wrong about many things, but he did get things right, and I think that his testimony is a flourishing department today, so I hope we can thank him for that. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a masterly account of a very interesting one. Now, questions, comments, Chris?
Two stories probably apocryphal and a question.
Yeah.
So the first story is Lad was left moribund by Clifton.
Yeah.
Clifton is said to have said that the desire to do research betrays an undue restlessness of mind.
So is he working at the Trump administration? He ought to be, anyway, great quote.
This is, I've heard this.
Yeah.
The second is that, and Roger will know if this is true, that in the room in the old Clarendon where Mendelssohn liquefied helium, there was a plaque up something on the wall, so in this room, Mendelssohn for the first time in England liquefied. And that was still there when it was converted into a lavatory later. And my question,
We're looking forward to his summer at the end of the day.
my question, maybe I missed this, that you said, what was the source of the Lindemann family wealth?
His father was I think he was a banker. Will someone know better than me on this?
He was from Alsace, was he not?
He was Alsace. But somebody knows more than me, yes?
His father returned to the homeland and found that he couldn't get a bath. And so the local mayor said, well, you know, had to pay for a donkey to bring water up to the hotel. And Lindemann Sr. said, well, surely you could have a water system. And the local mayor challenged him, and in fact, the father duly took on the business of creating a waterworks. It was a place with Permians in the Platinum.
Right.
And that, in fact, they couldn't pay him, but they gave him shares, and it became so prosperous that eventually that effectively made Lindemann Sr. a millionaire. However, in the meantime, the family Peter Lindemann, in fact, used a lot of his wife's money to get this business going, and so the family went back to Germany to spend their summers, and it was there that where with family, Lindemann was born. And it was a chance that they were in.
Great. Well, thank you. That's great. Very good to know that. He was incredibly wealthy. I don't know how many graduate students there are today who live in a 5-star hotel. That's what he did in Berlin when he was working with
It's all
them.
in Portsmouth.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Yeah.
Good to see you. Somebody?
Small point.
Yeah.
The name of the young man you showed,
Oh.
which you didn't, I think, mention, but whose work you described in spectroscopy was cool.
Yes.
Right. Cool. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I miss it? I'm so sorry. I really apologize. Would you pass it behind? Oh, sorry. Yes.
I haven't seen it. Is this working?
Yeah.
I haven't seen it, but I understand that in the 30s, Lindemann wrote a book about special relativity. And I've read that it showed that he fundamentally misunderstood it.
Yes, I can tell you. This is actually, as I said, this is where it's trying with Lindemann. Two things. When he understood something, he was a masterly expositor. I mean, seriously, when Churchill finally got his finger out in April 1943, Lindemann's account of research on atomic, on nuclear physics and nuclear was superbly written. I mean, you really would not get Richard Dawkins writing better than that, right? When he didn't understand something, it was a complete mess, right? And there are two examples, right? One is he wrote an account of general relativity, which I sent to, and I'm not going to name this person, right, a master general relativist about 8 years ago when I was researching Churchill bomb, and he said it was complete rubbish, right, which is quite amazing actually, right? That was just after we came here. Worse, this is far more important in terms of serious discussion. He wrote a book on quantum theory, right, that I think you could fairly say demonstrated he had no grasp at all of the subject. That's where the Dirac anecdote came from, where he even had a seminar on it, which is a very dangerous thing to do. He sent it to Rutherford, right? They were still talking at the time. And this was where somebody said, after hearing Lindemann talk nonsense about quantum theory, in 1932, right, I just despair. You know, there's absolutely no original ideas, right? There's complete mess. And Dirac turned to these people and said, some of those mistakes were unique to him. What amazes me, someone so smart, is they put it in a book. You know, that's what's so extraordinary. Didn't understand basic analytical mechanics. It's extraordinary. Anyway, but let's pass over. Let's remember what's better now.
You rather passed over the other person who tried to rescue Oxford physics from Bellamy Clifton, namely Townsend.
Yes.
And of course Townsend Electrical Lab remained independent.
It did.
Until Townsend retired in the 1940s.
Yes.
So Lindemann was not the head of physics.
No, that's true.
Until he had gone.
No, I did mention.
And Townsend's chair was given to theoretical physics.
No, that's right. I did mention it because frankly, the poison between those two people was. So we see so much of this hacker club. Let's face it. You know, I mean, two good people. They both wanted the turf, but I was asked to speak about the Renaissance, and I think it's fair to say that Lindemann was responsible for the lion's share of that.
Oh yes. Townsend was a failure in a sense.
He was. I'm sure he had his strengths, but it was a horrible double act.
President.
Yeah, it's maybe worth mentioning that the most important contribution to physics made in the Clifton era was actually Henry Moseley, working first in the Trinity lab and then in his home.
Yeah.
And he was not part of the physics establishment. And it's pretty clear from all the principals said, if he had not been killed deliberately, he would have won Nobel Prize. I think everybody would agree with that.
Yes, definitely.
And one of the last acts of Nicholas Curtis' life, I was going to say this in my concluding remarks, was to agitate strongly that a blue plaque should be put up on the building of the Moseley family home. It's part of Sedan's now. And I hope the plaque is still there.
That's excellent.
In about 1990.
Very good point. Thank you. One more.
Just another point regarding Lindemann's study in Germany, it was actually a default situation. The father originally sent both Lindemann and his elder brother to school in Scotland, and because he was both the boys and the father were so disappointed in the lack of science of that school, that they then were sent to the Lyceum or the Gymnasium in Darmstadt as undergraduates,
Yes.
and then both of them went on to go to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute.
And it's funny because his brother ended up in Washington as a functionary, of course, and he's younger. Yeah, Lindemann managed to mess up his entire relationship with his family. He had a younger brother who was a playboy, who spent his wealth on, for example, he had a black Rolls Royce and a white Rolls Royce, and the chauffeurs, the white one was a person of dark skin, and the other one, it's true, actually true. And a sister with whom he fell out about misplacing a handkerchief or something like that, with whom he did not speak until his death, and she went to his funeral. But he did not speak to her after that minor family argument. His grudge bearing was epic.
One other character who Lindemann got was Derek Jackson.
Yes,
That was a real character.
Yeah.
Freelance.
Yes, indeed.
As I was going to St Ives, I met a man with 7 wives. He only had 6, actually. And his money came from the News of the Royal.
So did a lot of churches.
Yeah.
Roger, is it a true story that Jackson was once, there was a wire running from his Rolls Royce into the building, and Lindemann said, hey, you shouldn't be using university electricity to charge your car. And he said, no, it's not like that. My Rolls Royce has a more stable output.
It's a more reliable source of direct current.
Supposedly, he also added that you shouldn't bite the hand that feeds you.